14 people at that table. Nobody moved. Not even the man who asked me to sign it. My husband slid the envelope toward me like it was part of the place setting, like it belonged there between the fork and the napkin I had ironed that morning while the coffee went cold beside the sink. He didn't look at me when he did it. He never did. Not when something mattered. "Just some paperwork, Maggie," Harold said, reaching for the gravy boat as if the sentence had already done its job. My son Preston leaned back in his chair, one arm hooked over the back, comfortable in a way that made the room feel smaller for everyone else. "It's nothing complicated, Mom. Just sign where it's marked." Lydia didn't even lift her head at first. Her thumb kept moving across her phone, a quiet, steady flick. "Let's not do this tonight," she said. Then she looked up, just long enough to land it. "Don't make this a whole thing." I remember the table more than anything else. The plates were the good ones, the ones with the thin gold rim that always made me careful when I dried them, as if I could chip something that didn't belong to me to break. I'd stood at the sink for almost an hour that afternoon, drying each one by hand, stacking them slowly so they wouldn't touch. The turkey had taken 4 hours, the stuffing, 2 kinds. Preston liked it dry, Lydia liked it soft. I'd burned my hand on the oven rack at 3:30 and held it under cold water until the sting turned into something dull and manageable. No one had noticed. No one ever really did. The envelope sat to the right of my plate, cream-colored, thick. There was a yellow tab sticking out of the top with a black arrow and the word "sign" printed in a font that assumed compliance. Beneath it, I could see my name, Margaret Ellison. I picked up the pen. It wasn't mine. It was one of Preston's, heavy, expensive, the kind that clicks louder than it needs to, like it's announcing something important. The plastic felt too smooth in my hand. I pressed the top once. The click landed in the quiet like a small decision. "Mom," Preston said again, softer now, patient in the way you are when you've already decided the outcome. "We've already gone over this. It's just easier if everything's under one name. For taxes." "For protection," Lydia added. "You don't want to deal with all that, do you?" I opened the envelope and slid the first page out. The paper was heavier than normal, the kind used for documents meant to last longer than the people who signed them. The words were tight and crowded, long sentences that bent back on themselves. I recognized a few: property, transfer, authorization, but the rest moved past me, like a conversation I'd walked into too late. "See," Lydia said, watching me now. "This is what I mean. It's confusing. That's why we're helping you." Helping. That word had been following me lately, showing up at the same moments. When I asked about a bill, when I couldn't find something I knew I'd put in the same place for years. When I said, "That doesn't sound right." "We're just trying to help you, Mom." I lowered the page. "What exactly is this for?" I asked, keeping my voice level, careful, the way you speak when you don't want to be told you're overreacting. Harold finally looked at me. His eyes moved from my face to the pen, then to the paper, measuring something I couldn't see. "It's just a formality," he said. "About the property." "What property?" A pause, small, but long enough to feel. "The lake house," Preston said quickly. "The one Aunt Rose had." My fingers tightened around the pen without me meaning to. "I thought that was sold." "It was," Lydia started, then stopped. "I mean, it's complicated." "It's not complicated," Harold said, a little too fast. "We explained this. The paperwork just needs to be cleaned up." Cleaned up. I looked back down at the page. Lake Wren property. The words sat there, flat and certain. I hadn't been back to Lake Wren in years. Not since Rose got sick. Not since the last summer we'd sat on that back porch with lemonade sweating in our hands while the sun dropped behind the trees and the lake went from blue to something darker, something deeper. She had looked at me then, really looked, the way people do when they're about to say something they've already decided is true. "I want you to have a place that's yours," she'd said. "Somewhere no one can rearrange you." I'd laughed. Told her she was being dramatic. Told her I had a house, I had a family, I was fine. Sitting there now, with my name printed on a document I didn't understand, the memory didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt like something I had missed. "Mom," Preston said, sharper now. "We don't have all night." "Don't embarrass us," Harold added, low enough that it was almost private, heavy enough that it wasn't. There it was, different words, same shape. "Not everything has to be about you. Don't make this a whole thing. Don't embarrass us." I brought the pen down to the paper. The tip hovered just above the line where my name was supposed to go. I could feel everyone waiting, not openly, not rudely, but in that quiet, practiced way families have when they already know how something ends. Before we continue, after you like and leave a comment, I hope something kind finds you this week. Maybe a quiet moment, maybe a conversation that feels real again. Tell me how old you are, where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I'd really like to know who's sitting at this table with me. Chúng ta cùng tiếp tục. The overhead light buzzed softly. One of the candles had started to lean, wax pulling at the base like it had given up trying to stay straight. Somewhere behind me, the refrigerator motor clicked on, a low hum that filled the space no one else was willing to fill. Normal sounds, ordinary things, and right in the middle of them, something that didn't feel ordinary at all. I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink touched first. A small point, then a line. Before she signs, a voice said from the other end of the table, calm and clear in a way that didn't ask permission. Someone should explain why Margaret is signing away a house that already belongs to her. The pen stopped. It didn't slip. It didn't fall. It just stopped. The ink pooled where my name should have been, a small dark circle spreading slowly into the paper, as if it had time. I lifted my head. Evelyn Price sat 2 seats down from Lydia, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had arrived late, just before dinner, with a small box of chocolates and an apology for the timing. I hadn't seen her in years, not since Rose's service. She looked exactly the same, composed, precise, like someone who doesn't waste words. She wasn't looking at anyone else. She was looking at me. "Excuse me?" I said. No one answered. Harold's fork slipped from his hand and tapped against the plate. Preston sat up too quickly, his chair scraping the floor. Lydia's phone went dark in her hand. "Margaret," Evelyn said, gently now. "Did anyone here tell you that your sister transferred the Lake Wren property into your name 3 years ago?" For a moment, the question didn't land. It hovered somewhere just above understanding, too simple for what it meant. "What?" Silence. The kind where you can hear the clock in the hallway ticking, each second a little louder than the last. "I assumed you knew," Evelyn continued. Rose was very clear. The deed was signed, notarized, and filed. The house is yours. I turned my head slowly toward Harold. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the tablecloth, at the edge of the envelope, like if he held his focus there long enough, nothing else would move. "Harold," I said. His throat moved before the words did. "There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Evelyn repeated. Not louder, just enough to let the words sit in the air where everyone could see them. Preston leaned forward. "This isn't the time." "No," Evelyn said, cutting him off without raising her voice. "This is exactly the time." I looked back down at the paper in front of me, at the line where my name was supposed to go, at the ink that had already started it, at the place where I had almost given something away without ever knowing it had been mine. My hand started to shake then. Not much, just enough that I could feel it. "I don't understand," I said. "I was told it was sold." "By whom?" Evelyn asked. No one answered. I looked around the table, at my son, my daughter, my husband, the people I had fed and driven and waited up for and forgiven in ways that had never required an apology in return. No one met my eyes, and in that moment, quiet, ordinary, sitting at a table I had set myself, I felt something shift underneath everything I thought I knew. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to know it had already begun. This wasn't about paperwork. It never had been. I didn't notice it all at once. That would have been easier to fight. It happened the way small things usually do in a house you've lived in for too long. Quietly, gradually, in ways that make sense in the moment and only feel wrong when you try to put them all together later. I retired on a Tuesday in early October, the kind of day that starts out colder than you expect and never quite warms up, even when the sun comes out. I remember because I wore the blue cardigan Rose had given me 5 years before, the one with the loose thread at the cuff that I kept meaning to fix and never did. I thought it would feel like an ending, or maybe a beginning, something that marked the shift from one kind of life to another. Instead, it felt like I had simply walked out of one room and into another, where everything looked the same but belonged to someone else. At the hospital, there had been a cake I didn't want and a card everyone had signed in handwriting that tilted differently depending on how well I knew them. People hugged me, told me to rest, told me I had earned it. One of the younger nurses, a girl with nervous hands and a habit of double-checking everything twice, had said, "I don't know what we're going to do without you." And I had smiled the way you do when someone says something kind that isn't entirely true. Because places always figure it out. They always do. I drove home just before 5, the sky already dimming at the edges, and sat in the driveway for a few minutes longer than I needed to, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I thought about what the next day would look like without a schedule, without a reason to leave the house before the coffee finished brewing. I thought about sleeping in, about reading, about maybe driving out to Lake Wren just to see it again from the road, even if I didn't stop. When I finally went inside, Harold was in the living room, watching the news with the volume turned just a little too high, the way he always did when he didn't want to talk.
"You're home early?"
he said, not turning around. "I'm retired," I said, setting my purse on the table by the door, the same place I had set it every day for years. "Remember?" He glanced at me then, just for a second.
"Right,"
he said.
"That."
There was a pause, not uncomfortable exactly, just empty.
"Well,"
he added, picking up the remote again.
"you'll have more time for things around here."
I stood there a moment longer than I should have, my hand still resting on the back of the chair, waiting for something else to follow. Congratulations, maybe, or are you okay, or what are you going to do now? Nothing came. I went into the kitchen, rinsed out my coffee mug from that morning, and set it in the drying rack like it was any other day. The next morning, I woke up at 6 out of habit. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when no one else has to be anywhere yet. The kind of quiet that used to feel like a gift when I had somewhere to go. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, toast. Enough for 3 because that's what I had always done. Harold came in around 7, already dressed, tie loose around his neck. He sat down, picked up the fork, took a bite, and nodded once. "Eggs are good," he said. "Thank you," I said. He finished eating, stood, rinsed his plate halfway, and set it in the sink. "You might want to start keeping up with the bills now that you're home," he said, not unkindly, just as a matter of fact. "It's easier if one person handles it." I nodded. That made sense. I had always been better with details. "Also," he added, pausing at the door, "Preston might need help with some paperwork this week. He mentioned it the other night." "Of course," I said. And that was how it started. Not with a request, not really, with something that sounded like logic. By the end of that first week, I had reorganized the kitchen cabinets, updated the calendar on the wall, called the insurance company about a letter Harold had ignored, and driven across town twice to pick up groceries for Lydia because she didn't have time. By the second week, Preston had dropped off a stack of documents that needed sorting, highlighting, copying, and returning as soon as possible, which meant I stayed up later than I intended at the dining table with a yellow highlighter in one hand and my reading glasses slipping down my nose. By the third week, Lydia had started texting me in the mornings. "Mom, can you grab Sophie from school at 3? Mom, the babysitter canceled again. Can you come by? Mom, I left a load of laundry in the washer. Can you switch it over?" Always phrased like a question, always expected like an answer. I said yes to all of it. At first because it felt temporary, like something you do while everyone adjusts. then because it became easier to say yes than to explain why you wouldn't. The days filled up in a way that didn't leave much space to notice they were filling up. I started keeping a small notebook on the counter just to keep track of things. It wasn't anything formal, just dates and short lines in the same blue pen I use for grocery lists. October 12th. Paid electric bill, called insurance, hold time, 27 minutes. October 14th. Picked up Sophie, made dinner at Lydia's. October 17th. Sorted Preston's paperwork, 4 hours. October 19th. Grocery run, mine plus Lydia's. At first, it was practical. I didn't want to forget something important. After a while, it became something else. Proof, maybe. Or a way of reminding myself that I hadn't imagined how much of me was being used. There were small moments, too. The kind that don't sound like much when you say them out loud, but stay with you anyway. Like the afternoon I was in Lydia's kitchen, folding laundry that wasn't mine, the hum of the dryer still running behind me when she walked in, glanced at the neat stacks on the counter and said, "You missed a sock," before walking out again. Or the time Preston handed me his car keys and said,
Can you take this in for an oil change? You got the time.
As if time were something I had been given instead of something I had earned. Or the way Harold started leaving unopened envelopes on the counter with my name written on the outside in his handwriting, like he was assigning them to me without ever saying the words.
You're better at this stuff,
he would say when I asked. Better. The word sounded like a compliment. It didn't feel like one. By November, I realized I hadn't sat down to read a book once. I hadn't slept past 6. I hadn't driven anywhere that wasn't for someone else. I told myself it would slow down after the holidays, that things were just busy, that this was what families did for each other. But there was a moment, one evening just before Thanksgiving, that stayed with me in a way I couldn't quite shake. I was standing at the sink, washing dishes after dinner, the water running hotter than it needed to be because the kitchen always felt colder at night. The window above the sink had started to fog at the edges, blurring the view of the backyard into something softer, less defined. In the living room, I could hear Harold and Preston talking. Not loudly, just enough that the words carried if you weren't trying too hard to ignore them. "She's home now," Preston said. "It just makes sense." "I know," Harold replied. "It's easier this way." Easier. I stood there with my hands in the water a little longer than necessary, a plate already clean in my grip, the sponge still pressed against it like there was something left to scrub. No one had asked me if I wanted this. No one had said, "Are you tired?" Or, "Is this too much?" Or even, "Thank you," in a way that meant more than a passing acknowledgement. It wasn't that they were cruel. That would have been clearer, easier to name. They were efficient. They arranged things, shifted responsibilities, filled in spaces, and slowly, without ever saying it out loud, they moved me into a role that didn't require me to be seen. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and stood there for a second in the dim kitchen, listening to the low murmur of voices from the other room. For most of my life, I had believed that if you kept showing up, if you did what needed to be done without making a fuss about it, it would count for something. That night, standing there with the house quiet around me, I realized something I hadn't let myself think before. It did count, just not in the way I had expected, and not in my favor. My sister died on a Thursday morning in late spring, and the first thing I remember is not the phone call or the drive or even the moment they told me she was gone. It was the smell. Not in the hospital. That part was clean in the way hospitals are always clean. Too bright and too careful, like nothing real is allowed to stay long enough to leave a mark. I remember the smell when I opened the front door of her house 2 days later. Cedar, old paper, a trace of lemon from the cleaner she used on the counters. And underneath all of it, something quieter. Something that had always been there if you knew how to notice it. The smell of a place that had been lived in by someone who paid attention to small things. Rose had lived alone for most of her life, but her house never felt empty. It felt arranged. Not in the way Lydia arranged things, moving furniture and pictures until everything looked right from a distance, but in the way you arrange a space you intend to come back to. There was always a book left open somewhere, a mug with a faint ring at the bottom where the coffee had cooled. A sweater draped over the back of a chair as if she had just stepped into the next room and would return in a minute. She didn't. The lawyer handled most of the formalities. There were papers, signatures, conversations that happened in low voices just out of reach. I sat at Rose's kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing, listening without really hearing, answering when someone said my name. Harold took over where things needed taking over. He always did that well, stepping into spaces that required decisions, speaking with a kind of quiet certainty that made people assume he knew more than he actually did. "I'll take care of it," he said more than once, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder as if he were steadying me. "You don't need to worry about all the details." I didn't argue. Grief has a way of making everything feel distant, like you're watching your own life from the other side of a window. Things happen, decisions get made, and you nod because it seems like the right response, even when you don't fully understand what you're agreeing to. A week after the funeral, we were sitting at our kitchen table, the same one where the envelope would appear years later, though I didn't know that then. And I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind. "What's going to happen to the house?" I said. Harold didn't look up right away. He was flipping through a stack of papers, the edges aligned neatly, his thumb moving down the side in small, practiced motions. "It's being handled," he said. "What does that mean?" He exhaled softly, not irritated, not exactly, just tired in the way people get when they think they've already explained something. "There were expenses," he said. "Taxes, medical bills, legal fees. It adds up." I waited. "She didn't leave anything important, Maggie," he added, finally looking at me. "Not after everything was settled." The sentence landed in a way that didn't make a sound. Not after everything was settled. I nodded. That was what I did in moments like that. I took the answer, turned it over once in my mind, and set it down somewhere I wouldn't trip over it later. "That makes sense," I said. It didn't, not really. But it was easier to say that than to ask another question and risk being told I was making things harder than they needed to be. Over the next few weeks, small pieces of Rose's life made their way into boxes. Her clothes went to donation. Her books were sorted, some kept, most given away. The kitchen was cleared methodically, drawers emptied, cabinets wiped clean. I stood there more than once with a dish in my hands, trying to remember when she had last used it, what she had cooked, who she had cooked for. I kept a few things, not much. A sweater, a set of measuring spoons she had once insisted were the only ones that get it right, and a small wooden box from the back of a shelf, the kind you almost miss if you're not looking for it. It was oak, worn smooth at the corners, the grain darker where hands had touched it over the years. The hinge stuck a little when I opened it, just enough that you had to press down gently before it gave. Inside were index cards, dozens of them, written in Rose's handwriting, recipes, notes, small adjustments in the margins that only made sense if you knew how she cooked. I ran my fingers over the top card without reading it. For a moment, I considered taking the whole box with me. Then Harold called from the other room. "Maggie, we should get going." I closed the lid and set it back where I had found it. "I'll come back for it," I said out loud, though no one had asked. I never did. By early summer, the house was no longer Rose's. The furniture was gone. The walls had that empty echo that comes when a space has been cleared of everything that made it specific. I walked through it once more, slowly, touching the edge of the counter, the back of the chair, the door frame where she had once measured my height when we were younger, marking the wood with a pencil and a small, satisfied smile. I paused at the back door, my hand resting on the handle, looking out toward where the lake would have been if I had driven another 20 minutes past town. I could almost see it if I tried hard enough, the line of trees, the way the water caught the light at the end of the day. "She loved that place," I said quietly. Harold was behind me, already halfway out the door. "It's taken care of," he replied. Taken care of. I let the door close. For a while after that, I didn't think about Lake Wren, not directly. It showed up in small ways instead, the way memories do when they're not given a place to settle. In the smell of cedar when I opened a closet, in the way the light hit the kitchen table in the late afternoon, in the sound of water running somewhere in the background when there wasn't any. Once, in early fall, I drove past the turnoff without meaning to. My hands tightened on the steering wheel when I saw the sign, Lake Wren Road, the letters slightly faded, the arrow pointing down a narrow stretch of asphalt lined with trees that looked the same as they always had. I slowed. Not enough to turn, just enough to feel the pull of it. Then the car behind me honked, sharp and impatient, and I pressed the gas again, letting the moment pass the way I had let everything else pass. It wasn't until much later, sitting at that Christmas table with a pen in my hand and my name already half written on a line I didn't understand, that the pieces began to move. Lake Wren property, the words on the page. The way Harold had said, she didn't leave anything important. The way the lawyer had spoken in low tones I hadn't been invited to fully hear. The wooden box I had set back on the shelf because someone had called my name and I had answered. I had believed him. Not because the explanation made sense, but because it came from someone I had spent my life trusting to tell me the truth, even when it wasn't convenient. Sitting there now, the memory of that kitchen, that house, that moment when I chose not to ask another question, didn't feel like something that had simply happened. It felt like something that had been guided, directed, arranged in a way I hadn't recognized at the time. And beneath all of it, quieter than everything else but harder to ignore once you heard it, was a thought that settled in slowly, like something finding its place after being displaced for too long. My sister had left me something. Not nothing. Something real. Something that had been mine long before I ever saw my name printed on that paper. And I had walked away from it without knowing. Not because it wasn't there, but because someone had made sure I never saw it. It didn't begin with an accusation. It began with a correction, a small one. The kind that slips into a conversation so quietly, you almost thank the person for catching it. The first time I remember it clearly, I was standing in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, the light coming in low through the window above the sink, hitting the counter in that thin, angled way that made everything look a little softer than it actually was. I had a stack of envelopes in front of me, bills mostly, and I was sorting them the way I always had, by due date, by amount, by the quiet logic that had kept our household running for decades without anyone needing to think too hard about it. There was one envelope I didn't recognize. It was thicker than the others, with the kind of paper banks use when they want something to feel official before you even open it. My name was printed on the front, Margaret Ellison, not handwritten, printed. I slid my finger under the edge and opened it carefully, the way I always did, so I wouldn't tear anything important. The letter inside was only 2 pages long, but it took me longer than it should have to read it. Not because the words were complicated, but because they didn't fit with anything I thought I knew. Account statement, equity line, Lake Wren property. I read it twice, then a third time, slower, tracing each line with my finger like I might have missed something the first 2 times. A balance, a withdrawal, a number that sat on the page like it belonged there. It didn't. I stood there for a moment, the paper still in my hand, listening to the sound of the refrigerator cycling on behind me, the low hum filling the space where my thoughts should have been clearer. Harold? I called, not raising my voice, just enough to carry into the living room. He didn't answer right away. The television was on, something loud enough to blur into noise. I waited, then called again. He came into the kitchen with that same expression he always wore when he had been interrupted in the middle of something he considered more important. "What is it?" he asked. I held out the letter. "What is this?" He glanced at it, not a full read, just a look. "Nothing," he said, reaching for it. I didn't let go immediately. "It says there's a loan," I said, "on Lake Wren." He exhaled, a short breath through his nose, and then gently, but firmly, pulled the paper from my hand. "It's a bank error," he said. "They send those out all the time." "All the time?" I repeated, because that didn't sound right, even as I said it. "Yes," he said, already folding the paper once, then again, the creases sharp, practiced. "You know how these things are." I didn't, not really, but I nodded anyway, because that was the moment where the conversation usually ended. It didn't, though, not that time. It has my name on it, I said, more quietly now, not pushing, just stating. That's because everything is in your name, he replied, too quickly. It's always been that way. That wasn't true, not entirely, not the way he said it. Before I could respond, Lydia walked in, her keys in one hand, her phone in the other, the smell of her perfume arriving before she did. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between us. "Your mother's worrying about nothing," Harold said, already moving past me toward the trash can, the folded letter still in his hand. "I'm not," I started. Lydia set her keys down on the counter with a small, controlled clink. "Mom," she said, her voice softer than usual, but not warmer. "What is it?" I hesitated, just for a second. "There was a statement," I said, "about a loan on Lake Wren." Lydia didn't look surprised, not exactly, but something in her face shifted, a quick adjustment, like she was choosing how to respond. "Mom," she said, stepping closer, lowering her voice the way you do when you're trying not to make something a scene. "You've been confused lately." The word landed differently than I expected. Confused. "I'm not confused," I said, though I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice before I finished the sentence. "It's okay," she continued, placing a hand lightly on my arm, the gesture gentle enough that anyone watching might have called it caring. "This is exactly why we've been trying to help you with things like this." Help. Again. "I just asked a question," I said. "And we answered it," Harold replied from behind me, the sound of the trash can lid closing a little louder than necessary. "It's nothing you need to worry about." I stood there for a moment, my eyes moving from Lydia's hand on my arm to the empty space on the counter where the letter had been. It had been there. I knew it had. "You don't remember us talking about this?" Lydia asked, her head tilting slightly, the way she did when she wanted something to sound more reasonable than it was. "No," I said. "We went over it last month," she said, "after you got that other letter." "What other letter?" Another pause, this one longer. Preston's voice came from the doorway. "What's going on?" "Mom's just mixed up," Lydia said, not turning around. I felt something tighten in my chest. "I'm not mixed up," I said, more firmly this time, though the words didn't carry the weight I wanted them to. Preston stepped into the kitchen, his expression already set somewhere between concern and impatience. "Mom," he said, softer than usual, the tone different now, adjusted, careful. "We're worried about you." The sentence sat there, heavier than anything else that had been said. Worried. "About what?" I asked. "You've been forgetting things," he said. "Small stuff. Conversations, bills. It's not a big deal, but we noticed." I searched his face for something familiar, for the boy who used to come home with scraped knees and ask me to fix things he couldn't name, for the version of him that had trusted me without question. I couldn't find him. "I haven't been forgetting things," I said, though even as I said it, something inside me shifted, just slightly. Because there were things, small things. A bill I thought I had already paid that showed up again, a phone call I didn't remember making, a conversation that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. They had been easy to dismiss at the time. Everyone forgets things. That's what I had told myself. Now, standing there with both of them looking at me the same way, steady, concerned, certain, I felt something else settle in underneath that explanation. Doubt. "Mom," Lydia said again, softer now, her thumb brushing lightly against my sleeve in a motion that might have been comforting if it hadn't felt so deliberate. "No one is saying anything is wrong. We just want to make things easier for you." Easier. I nodded. Not because I agreed, not completely, but because the alternative required a level of certainty I suddenly wasn't sure I had. "Okay," I said. The word came out quieter than I intended. Preston gave a small, relieved nod. Lydia's hand slipped away from my arm. "Good," she said. That's all we're asking. They moved on after that, the way people do when something has been resolved to their satisfaction. Lydia picked up her keys again. Preston checked his phone. Harold turned the television volume back up in the other room. The kitchen returned to its usual shape. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the counter, at the place where the letter had been, trying to recall exactly what it had said, the numbers, the phrasing, anything that might anchor it to something solid. It blurred. Not completely. Just enough that I couldn't hold on to it the way I wanted to. I reached for the notebook I kept by the side of the refrigerator, the one with the blue pen clipped to the cover, and flipped it open to a blank page. For a second, I hesitated. Then I wrote, November 3rd, letter from bank. Loan? Lake Wren? Harold said error. Lydia says we discussed before. I don't remember. I stared at the words after I finished, at the question mark in the middle of the line, at the way my own handwriting suddenly looked unfamiliar to me. I closed the notebook and set it back where it had been. That night, I lay in bed, my bed, still upstairs then, before that changed too, and replayed the conversation in my head, not once, not twice, but enough times that the edges of it started to soften. Had we talked about it before? Had I missed it? Forgotten? The question didn't have an answer, not one I could prove. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not what they said, but how easy it suddenly felt to wonder if they might be right. Because if they were, if I really had missed something that important, then everything else they were doing, handling the bills, managing the paperwork, asking me to sign things without explaining them fully, it would all make sense. It would all be necessary. I turned onto my side, staring at the faint outline of the window across the room, the streetlight outside casting a dull, steady glow through the curtains. For most of my life, I had trusted my memory without question. That night, for the first time, I didn't. And once that doubt settled in, quiet and persistent, it didn't leave. It just waited, for the next time I wasn't sure. It wasn't presented as a decision. It was framed as a precaution. The kind of thing people say when they want to move you without saying they're moving you, when they want the outcome, but not the responsibility of admitting it out loud. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind where the house feels slower than usual, like everything has decided to take a step back at the same time. I remember because I was folding laundry at the foot of the bed, pairing socks that didn't quite match the way they used to, smoothing out shirts that belonged to people who didn't live in that room anymore, but still somehow filled it. Harold was in the doorway when he said it.
We've been talking,
he began, which was always the first sign that something had already been decided without me. I kept folding. About what? About you, Lydia said, appearing behind him, leaning one shoulder against the frame like she was stepping into a conversation she had rehearsed. I placed the last shirt in the stack, aligning the edges a little more carefully than necessary before looking up. What about me? There was a small pause, not long, just enough for them to settle into their roles. You've been unsteady lately, Lydia said. The stairs aren't ideal. I'm fine on the stairs, I replied. Preston's voice came from the hallway.
Mom, you almost slipped last week.
I thought about that. I had caught myself on the railing, yes, but I had caught myself. That was the part that mattered. I didn't fall, I said.
But you could have.
Harold answered, stepping further into the room now, his tone firm in the way he used when he wanted something to sound final.
We're just trying to think ahead.
Think ahead. For your health, Lydia added. It's safer if you're on the first floor. Safer. The words sat there, polished, reasonable, difficult to argue with without sounding like you were arguing against your own well-being. I looked around the room then, not quickly, not dramatically, just taking it in. The dresser by the window, the chair in the corner where I used to sit with a book I hadn't opened in months, the small indentation in the mattress on my side of the bed where I had slept for years without thinking about it. My things are here, I said. We'll move them, Preston replied, already halfway inside, as if the statement itself had given him permission. I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, just present. You don't have to do everything at once, Lydia continued, her voice softer now, layered with something that might have passed for concern if it hadn't been so carefully placed. We set up the guest room downstairs. It's actually nicer, more light. I almost smiled at that. The guest room had one small window that faced the side of the house where the fence blocked most of the afternoon sun. The light it got was thin, indirect, the kind that made everything look slightly dimmer than it actually was. "I've slept in this room for 40 years, I said. "And now you don't have to," Harold replied. The answer came too easily, too clean. "This is my room," I said, and the words felt heavier than I expected once they were out in the open. "This is my house, too." There was a moment, just a moment, where I thought something might shift, where someone might pause long enough to reconsider. Harold didn't raise his voice, he didn't step closer. He didn't do anything that would have made the moment look like an argument to someone standing outside the door. He just looked at me, steady, controlled, and said, "Not everything has to be about you, Margaret." The sentence didn't echo, it didn't need to. It landed exactly where it was meant to, quiet and precise, like something that had been measured before it was spoken. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I suddenly understood that whatever I said next would be folded into the same shape they had already decided on. Resistance would become proof. Emotion would become confusion. Any attempt to hold my ground would be turned into something else. "She's getting worked up," Preston said from behind me, as if I had already done something more than stand there. "I'm not worked up," I replied, but the words felt thinner now, stretched across something that wasn't holding the way it used to. "Mom," Lydia said gently, stepping forward, her hand reaching for my arm in that same practiced way, light enough to seem kind, firm enough to guide. "We're doing this for you. For you." I looked down at her hand, then back at the room, at the dresser, the chair, the bed, at the life I had lived in this space without ever needing to ask permission. "Just for a little while," she added, as if time could soften what the decision had already made permanent. I nodded. I don't remember deciding to nod. I just remember the moment after it, when everyone moved at once, the way people do when something has been settled and there's no reason to wait anymore. Preston started with the closet. He opened the door and began lifting hangers off the rod in small groups, his movements efficient, unhurried, like he was packing up a room that had already been vacated. "Careful with that," I said, more out of habit than anything else. "I've got it," he replied. Lydia moved to the dresser, pulling open drawers, folding things differently than I would have, faster, less concerned with how they lay once they were put away. Harold stood near the door, watching, his arms crossed loosely, as if overseeing a project he had already approved. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, not sure where to put myself. That was the part I hadn't expected. Not the decision, not even the way it had been delivered, but the feeling of not knowing where I belonged in a space that had always been mine. I picked up a small stack of sweaters from the chair, holding them longer than necessary before carrying them out into the hallway. The stairs felt the same as they always had beneath my feet, solid, familiar. I descended slowly, one hand on the railing, aware now of the way they might be watching, measuring each step for signs of the weakness they had already decided was there. The guest room door was open. The bed had been made with a set of sheets I didn't recognize. The comforter was lighter than the one upstairs, thinner, easier to move. A small lamp sat on the nightstand, already plugged in, already placed. Everything had been prepared, not suggested, prepared. I set the sweaters on the bed and stood there for a moment, looking at the room the way you look at a place you're not sure you'll stay in. Upstairs, I could hear movement, drawers opening, hangers sliding, the quiet sounds of my life being relocated one piece at a time. Later, when everything had been moved, when the room upstairs no longer looked like mine even in the small ways that are hard to define, Lydia did something I didn't see until the next day. She hung new photographs in the hallway. I noticed them when I came up to get something I had forgotten, my glasses, I think, though I don't remember if I actually found them. 3 frames, all the same size, all new. In the first, Harold stood between Preston and Lydia, all of them smiling, the kind of smile that comes easily when you know you belong in the picture. In the second, Preston and his family at some event I didn't recognize. The background blurred just enough to keep the focus where it was meant to be. In the third, Lydia with the children, her arm wrapped around them in a way that felt complete. I stood there longer than I meant to, my eyes moving from one frame to the next, waiting for something to feel off. It didn't. That was the part that stayed with me. Nothing looked wrong. There was no empty space where I should have been, no obvious absence, just a series of images that made perfect sense on their own. Which meant the only thing that had changed was me. I went back downstairs slowly, my hand trailing along the wall as I passed, not for balance, not really, but for something else I couldn't quite name. That night, lying in the guest room, the ceiling lower, the air slightly cooler, I listened to the house settle around me in the way it always had. The pipes, the faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature, the distant hum of the refrigerator, everything was the same. Except the part that wasn't. For most of my life, I had believed that belonging was something you built over time, something that grew from the accumulation of small, consistent acts. Dinner after dinner, conversation after conversation, a life, laid out piece by piece. That night, staring up at a ceiling that wasn't mine, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Belonging can also be removed. Not all at once, not loudly, but carefully. Deliberately, until one day you look around and realize there is no place left in the room that has your name on it. It arrived on a Tuesday, folded into the stack of mail the way everything important seems to arrive, quietly, without announcement, mixed in with things that don't matter enough to draw your attention right away. I remember the envelope because it didn't feel like the others. The paper was heavier, the edges sharper, the kind of envelope that doesn't bend easily when you press it between your fingers. My name was printed on the front again, Margaret Ellison, not in handwriting, not in the looping script Lydia used when she left notes on the counter, but in that clean, mechanical font that made everything look official whether it was or not. I set it aside at first. There were other things to do. There were always other things to do. The dishwasher had finished its cycle, and the plates needed to be dried before Lydia came by with the kids because she didn't like it when the kitchen looked half done. There was a message from Preston about a document he needed me to find, something he had dropped off the week before that I had already filed in a folder labeled with his name because that was the system that worked. The envelope sat at the edge of the counter while I moved through the rest of it. Rinse, dry, stack, wipe, put away. By the time I came back to it, the light in the kitchen had shifted slightly, the afternoon leaning into that quieter part of the day where everything feels slower without actually stopping. I picked it up again, turning it over once, twice, as if something might be written on the back that would explain what was inside before I opened it. There wasn't. I slid my finger under the flap carefully, the way I always did, so the paper wouldn't tear in a way that made it harder to put back together later. The sound it made when it opened was small but distinct. A soft tear, controlled, final. Inside there were 2 pages. I pulled them out and held them in front of me, the top sheet slightly thicker than standard paper, the bottom one thinner, more flexible. The header was what caught my eye first. Statement summary, home equity line of credit. I felt my brow crease without meaning to. I didn't have a line of credit, at least not one I knew about. I read the first paragraph once, then again, slower the second time, the way you do when the words don't settle where they're supposed to. Account number, balance, activity. The numbers were specific, too specific to be a mistake. I traced the line with my finger. A withdrawal. Another. A series of dates that stretched back further than I expected, each one paired with an amount that didn't look like anything I had authorized. And then, just below it, in a line that sat there as if it belonged to me, property, Lake Wren, loan type, equity access. I stopped reading, not because I didn't want to know more, because I suddenly felt like I already knew enough to understand that something was wrong, even if I couldn't explain how. The refrigerator behind me clicked on, the low hum filling the kitchen again, and for a second I just stood there, the paper still in my hands, listening to that sound like it might steady something that had shifted. "Harold?" I called. My voice came out even, almost normal, which surprised me. There was no answer at first. The television was on in the living room, louder than it needed to be, the volume turned up just enough that voices blurred into something indistinct. I waited a moment, then called again. "Harold?" He appeared in the doorway with that same look he had worn the day of the first letter. Mild interruption, controlled patience, the sense that whatever I was about to say would be something he already had an answer for. "What is it?" he asked. I held out the paper. He didn't take it right away. "What is this?" I said. He stepped closer then, his eyes moving over the page quickly, not reading so much as confirming. "It's nothing," he said, and reached for it. This time, I let go. "Nothing?" I repeated, watching the paper shift from my hand to his. "It's a statement," he said, already folding it once, then again, his fingers moving with the same quiet efficiency I had seen before. "Banks send these out all the time." I watched him fold it. The crease was clean, too clean. "It says there's a loan," I said, "on Lake Wren." The words felt strange in my mouth, like I was repeating something I had overheard rather than something that belonged to me. He didn't look at me when I said it. "It's a mistake," he replied. "A clerical error." I felt the same small pause I had felt the last time. "Then why does it have my name on it?" I asked. He exhaled softly, the sound controlled, measured. "Because your name is on everything," he said. "We've been through this." We hadn't, not like this. "Harold," I said, and there was something in my voice now I hadn't intended to put there, something closer to insistence than question. "I don't remember taking out any loan." He turned then, finally, his expression settling into something firmer. "That's because you didn't," he said. "It was handled." Handled. The word slid into place where explanation should have been. "By who?" I asked. Before he could answer, Lydia walked in. The door closed behind her with a soft click, the sound cutting through the space just enough to mark the moment. "What's going on?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter, her eyes moving quickly from Harold to me and then to the paper in his hand. "Nothing," Harold said. "There's a statement," I said, before he could say anything else, "about a loan on Lake Wren." Lydia didn't reach for the paper. She didn't even look at it. She looked at me, and in that look, something settled. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. "Mom," she said, her voice lowering slightly, the same tone she had used before. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" I asked. "Jumping to conclusions," she replied gently. "You've been confused lately." The words landed the same way they had the first time. Confused. "I'm not confused," I said, though the certainty I wanted to feel didn't quite arrive. "It's okay," she continued, stepping closer, her hand brushing lightly against the counter between us. "This is exactly why we've been trying to take some of this off your plate." Off your plate, as if the problem wasn't what I was seeing, but that I was seeing it at all. "It says Lake Wren," I said, quieter now, not arguing, just holding on to the one piece that felt solid. "That's Rose's house." "It was," Lydia corrected. "It's been handled." The same word. Handled. The way both of them said it, the same tone, the same finality, made something in my chest tighten. "How?" I asked. Another pause. Preston's voice came from the hallway, casual, as if he had been there longer than I realized. "Mom, we already went over this," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "You don't remember?" I looked at him, really looked, trying to find the place where the conversation he was referring to should exist. "I don't think we did," I said. He exchanged a glance with Lydia, quick, subtle, but there. "That's what I'm talking about," he said, turning back to me. You forget things, and then you get worked up about them. I'm not worked up, I said, though I could hear the edge in my voice now, thin but present. We're just trying to help you, Lydia added again, softer this time, her tone smoothing over the moment before it could become something sharper. That's all. I stood there, the three of them in front of me, the paper now folded in Harold's hand, the words I had read only minutes ago already starting to blur at the edges. Not completely, just enough. Enough that I had to concentrate to hold on to them. Enough that I could feel the doubt beginning to settle in, quiet and persistent. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there had been a conversation. Maybe I had been tired, distracted, not paying attention. It wasn't impossible. That was the part that made it difficult, because it wasn't impossible. Okay, I said finally. The word came out softer than I intended. Preston nodded once, satisfied. Lydia's shoulders relaxed slightly. Harold turned away, the paper disappearing somewhere I couldn't see. The moment closed. Not resolved, just closed. Later, when the kitchen was empty again and the house had settled back into its usual rhythm, I reached for the notebook by the refrigerator. I opened it to a blank page, the blue pen already in my hand. For a second, I just stared at it. Then I wrote, November 10th, bank statement, Lake Wren Equity Loan. Harold said error. Lydia said handled. Preston said we discussed before. I don't remember. I added the last line slower. I don't remember. I read it back once, twice, the words holding their shape on the page in a way they hadn't in my head. I closed the notebook and set it back in its place. Then I stood there, my hand still resting on the counter, the quiet of the kitchen pressing in around me, and let the thought form fully for the first time. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't had it. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what. I didn't know how. But the feeling was there now, steady, sitting just beneath everything else, and once it settled in, it didn't leave. It waited for the next piece. The first person who told me the truth didn't do it on purpose. She didn't come into the room with a folder or a plan or a voice prepared to say something difficult. She came in with her shoes half untied, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that had started to fall apart, and her phone in her hand like it had been there so long it had become part of how she moved. Nora never knocked. She had never needed to. Even after I was moved downstairs, even after the house had started to feel like something arranged around me instead of with me, she still came in the same way she always had, pushing a door open with her shoulder, already talking before she was fully inside, as if the space belonged to both of us in a way no one else questioned. Grandma, do you have... She started, then stopped when she saw me sitting at the small desk by the window, the notebook open in front of me, the pen resting across the page like I had set it down mid-thought. What are you doing? She asked, stepping further in, her voice softer now, curiosity replacing whatever she had come to ask for. Just writing something down, I said, closing the notebook a little more quickly than I meant to. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the cover for a second longer than necessary, the way hers always did when she noticed something that didn't quite fit. Nora noticed things. That had always been true. Even when she was younger, even when the rest of the house moved around her in predictable patterns, she paid attention in a way that made small details feel larger, more important than they were supposed to be. She dropped her bag onto the chair by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her phone still in her hand. I was working on something, she said, her thumb tapping the screen once, twice, as if deciding whether or not to show me. What kind of something? I asked. Just school, she replied, which usually meant it wasn't just school, but something connected to it, something she had followed further than she was supposed to because she had the time and the curiosity to do it. She hesitated again, then turned the phone toward me. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Her eyes moved between my face and the screen, searching for something, permission maybe, or the right way to say it.
Grandma, she began, and then stopped, the words stretching a little longer than usual, like she was buying herself time. Why didn't you tell anyone you owned a house? For a moment, the question didn't make sense, not because the words were complicated, but because they didn't fit into anything I understood about my own life. I don't, I said, the answer coming out automatically, the same way it had every time the idea had surfaced before. Nora didn't look convinced. She turned the phone slightly, angling it so the light from the window didn't glare across the screen. Then what is this? She asked. I leaned forward, my hand resting on the edge of the desk as I focused on the small text in front of me. It was a property record. I recognized the layout, even if I didn't remember ever looking at one for myself. Address, parcel number, tax information. A series of lines arranged in a way that suggested order, certainty, something official enough to be relied on. My eyes moved down the page slowly. Location, Lake Wren. The words sat there, steady, unchanged no matter how many times I blinked. I felt something shift in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, but undeniable. That's, I started, then stopped, because I didn't know how to finish the sentence. That's Aunt Rose's place, right? Nora said. Yes, I replied, my voice quieter now. It was. Nora tapped the screen again, bringing another section into view. Look at this part, she said. I did. Owner, Margaret Ellison. For a second, I thought I had read it wrong. The letters seemed too familiar, too close to something I recognized without understanding. I leaned in closer, read it again. Margaret Ellison. My name. Printed clearly, without hesitation, without question. No, I said, almost under my breath, that's not. I didn't finish the sentence, because there it was. Not something someone had told me, not something I could misremember. Something written, recorded, filed. Grandma, Nora said gently, watching me now instead of the screen, her voice carrying a kind of careful concern that felt different from the one I had heard from the others. This is public record, it's not, like, something random. It's real. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the desk. When did you find this? I asked. Last night, she said. I was looking up something for class, property values, zoning stuff. I typed in Lake Wren because I remembered you talking about it once, and then... She trailed off, lifting one shoulder slightly. Your name came up. My name, I repeated. She nodded. I thought you knew, she said. I mean, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't I? The question hung there, simple, in a way that made everything else feel more complicated. I was told it was sold, I said, the words slow, measured, like I needed to hear them out loud to understand how they sounded now. Nora frowned slightly. Sold to who? I don't know, I admitted. And you never saw anything? Like paperwork or... No, I said, a little more quickly than I intended. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was thinking, not judging. That's weird, she said. Weird. The word felt almost too small. I looked back at the screen, at my name sitting there in a place it had no right to be if everything I had been told was true. Can you scroll? I asked. She did, her thumb moving slowly now, carefully, as if she understood that each line mattered more than it had a moment ago. Dates. Transfer records. A line that indicated a change in ownership. I followed it with my eyes, the way I had followed the lines on the bank statement days before. The same feeling settled in. Not confusion, not exactly. Recognition. Something that had been present before, just out of reach, now stepping into view. This says it was transferred, Nora said, reading softly. 3 years ago. 3 years, around the time Rose had died. I felt my breath catch slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I did. That's when, I began, then stopped. Yes, Nora said quietly.
We sat there for a moment, neither of us speaking, the screen still glowing between us, the information on it not changing no matter how long we looked at it. "I didn't know," I said finally. "I believe you," she replied immediately. The answer came too fast to be rehearsed, too steady to be anything but true. I looked at her then, really looked, at the way her brow had creased slightly, at the way she was holding the phone now with both hands, as if it mattered that it didn't move. "You didn't think I was confused?" I asked, the word feeling heavier than it had before. Her expression shifted just slightly. "No," she said. "I mean, you forget small stuff sometimes. Everyone does. But this?" She shook her head. "No, this is different." Different. The word settled somewhere deeper. "Grandma," she said again, softer now. "Something's not right." I nodded. For the first time since the letter had arrived, since the conversations that followed, since the small, quiet corrections that had started to shape how I saw myself, I felt something shift back. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to recognize the feeling I had been trying to name. Something wasn't right. And now, for the first time, I wasn't the only one who could see it. "Don't tell anyone yet," I said. The words came out more firmly than I expected. Nora blinked, surprised for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "I want to understand this first," I added, "before—" I didn't finish the sentence. "Before they explain it away. Before they tell me I remembered it wrong. Before it becomes something else." Nora nodded again, slower this time. "Okay," she repeated. She locked the phone and set it down beside her, the screen going dark, but the image still clear in my mind. My name, on something that was supposed to have been gone. After she left the room, closing the door a little more quietly than usual, I sat there for a long time without moving, my hands resting in my lap, the notebook still closed in front of me. Then slowly, I reached for it, opened it to the last page, and wrote, November 14th. Nora found property record. Lake Wren still exists. Owner, me. I paused. The pen hovered above the page. Then I added, beneath it, I was told it was nothing. The words looked different now, not like a fact, like something that had been given to me, and something that, piece by piece, was starting to come apart. Once the idea settled in, that there was a house, that it had my name on it, that it had never been sold, the past didn't stay where I had left it. It started moving. Not all at once, not in a way that made everything clear. It came back in pieces, the way old memories do when they're nudged from the side instead of pulled forward directly. Small details, half-remembered conversations, the feeling of a moment before, the shape of it. I didn't go looking for it. It came to me anyway. It was late November, maybe early December, before the move downstairs, before the photographs changed, when Lydia had come over in the middle of the day. Not unusual. She came by often, usually with a reason that sounded simple enough to accept without thinking too hard about it. That day, she had a folder. I remember the folder now because of the way she held it. Close to her chest at first, then shifting it to the counter, opening it with a kind of quiet efficiency that made it feel like something we had already agreed to. Mom, I need you to sign a couple of things, she had said, not looking at me right away, already flipping through the pages. What is it? I had asked. Just insurance forms, she replied. Some updates. It's boring. Boring. That word had done more work than I realized at the time. I had nodded. Okay, I said. She had pulled out a pen, hers, not mine, and set it on top of the first page, tapping once where the line was. Here, she said, and there, and one more at the end. I remember the kitchen that day more clearly than the paper itself. The light was brighter than usual, the sun coming in directly through the window, catching the edge of the counter and the small scratches in the wood that I had learned to ignore over the years. There was a cup of tea beside me, half finished, a faint ring forming underneath it that I would wipe away later without thinking. I picked up the pen. What is this for, exactly? I asked again, more out of habit than suspicion.
It's just to make things easier, Lydia said, her tone light, almost distracted, like she was answering a question she had already answered. If anything comes up, medical, financial, I can help without having to track you down every time. Help. The same word. Always the same word. I looked down at the page. The text was dense, lines of print that moved together without clear breaks, the kind of document that expects you to trust the person handing it to you more than the words themselves. Do I need to read all of this? I asked. You can if you want, she said, but she didn't pause, didn't step back, didn't create the space for me to actually do it. It's standard. Everyone does it. Everyone does it. I nodded. Of course they did. I had signed things like that before, at the hospital, at the bank, forms that needed to be completed so something else could move forward. I placed the tip of the pen on the line. My name felt familiar under my hand then, certain, something I had written so many times it no longer required thought. Margaret Ellison. I signed once, then again where she pointed. Then a third time, at the bottom of the page, the signature slightly smaller, a little more rushed because the moment felt like it was supposed to be brief. There, Lydia said, gathering the papers together before I had even set the pen down completely. That's perfect. Is that all? I asked. Yeah, she replied, already sliding the documents back into the folder, aligning the edges with a practice motion. That was easy. Easy. She had smiled then, a quick, satisfied expression that didn't quite reach her eyes before she closed the folder and set it aside. I had picked up my tea again, taken a small sip, noticed it had gone lukewarm, and set it back down. The moment had passed, or I thought it had. Sitting now in the quiet of the guest room, the notebook open on my lap, Nora's words still echoing somewhere just beneath the surface. Grandma, why didn't you tell anyone you owned a house? The memory didn't feel small anymore. It felt precise, placed. I could see it more clearly now, the way Lydia had controlled the pace of the conversation, the way she had answered before I could fully ask, the way the pen had already been in her hand before I agreed. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the image settle. The paper, the lines, the places where I had signed without reading. A thought formed slowly, not fully shaped at first. Just a feeling that something connected where it hadn't before. I opened my eyes and reached for the notebook. Flipped to a new page. The pen felt heavier in my hand now. I wrote, November, date. Lydia brought forms, said insurance. Signed 3 places. Didn't read. I paused. The next line came slower. What did I sign? The question sat there, ink still fresh, the edges of the letters slightly darker where the pen had pressed harder than usual. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me, and let the room settle around the thought. Power, authority, access. Words I had seen before, in other contexts, in other documents that had belonged to other people. Words that meant something when they were connected to a signature. My signature. I stood up, the movement slower than it used to be but steady, and walked to the small dresser by the wall. The top drawer held things I had brought down from upstairs, papers mostly, the ones I had thought were important enough to keep close. I opened it and began to sort through them. Bank statements, utility bills, old receipts. Nothing from that day. Nothing that matched the folder Lydia had brought. Of course not. She had taken it with her. That had felt normal then. Now, it didn't. I closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the edge, my reflection faint in the mirror above it. For most of my life, signing my name had meant agreement, consent, understanding. Now, standing there in a room that had once belonged to guests, holding on to the memory of a document I had never really seen, it meant something else. Something I couldn't fully name yet, but something that had already been used. I went back to the desk and added one more line beneath the others. If that wasn't insurance, what was it? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. But for the first time, the question didn't feel like confusion. It felt like the beginning of something that had been hidden long enough to think it wouldn't be found. And once you realize something has been hidden from you, You don't stop at the first question. You keep going, even if you're not sure what you're going to find. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the part no one tells you. They tell you the truth sets you free, or that it hurts, or that it comes out all at once like something breaking through the surface, but they don't tell you what happens after. The quiet rearranging, the way every moment you thought you understood starts to shift slightly, just enough that it no longer sits where it used to. After Nora showed me the property record, I didn't confront anyone. Not right away. I moved through the house the same way I always had, doing the same things in the same order, but something had changed in the way I was watching it. I wasn't inside it anymore, not fully. I was observing, measuring, listening for things that didn't match the version of reality I had been given. And once I started paying attention like that, small details stopped feeling small. They began to line up. Preston had been coming by more often than usual. Not to visit, not really. He didn't sit down long enough for that. He came in with a purpose, moved through the house with a kind of contained urgency, checking his phone more than he looked at anyone, his conversations always just slightly ahead of wherever he was standing. "Just need a minute," he would say, already halfway into the next room. I noticed the way he avoided the living room when Harold was there, choosing the kitchen instead, lowering his voice just enough that it didn't carry, but not enough that it disappeared completely. Numbers came up, not clearly, not in full sentences, just fragments. "End of the month. Can't keep pushing it. They're not gonna wait." Once, late in the afternoon, I heard something else. "Preston!" Lydia said, sharper than usual, the word cutting through the space before she lowered her voice again. "You told me you had it handled." "I do," he replied, but there was something under it, something tight, controlled in the way people sound when they're trying to keep something from slipping. "Then why are they calling me?" she pressed. "They're calling everyone," he said. "That's what they do." A pause, then Lydia, quieter now, but more dangerous for it. "This better not come back on us." Us. I was standing at the sink at the time, my hands in the water, a plate already clean in my grip, the sponge resting against it like I needed something to do while I listened. I didn't turn around. I didn't make a sound, but I heard enough to understand that whatever Preston was dealing with, it wasn't small, and it wasn't contained. Lydia had her own version of it. Her attention had shifted in ways that didn't look like concern at first, just interest, focused interest, directed in specific places. The dining room table, for example. She started sitting there more often, her laptop open, papers spread out in front of her, columns of numbers written in a handwriting that was sharper than mine, more angular, less forgiving. Once, when she thought no one was watching, she tapped her pen against the edge of the table in a slow, steady rhythm, her eyes fixed on a page I couldn't see. I walked past her then, not stopping, just long enough to catch a glimpse of a number circled twice. 650,000. It meant nothing at the time. Or rather, it meant something I didn't yet know how to connect. "Mom," she said without looking up, "did you need something?" "No," I replied, "just passing through." She nodded, already back inside whatever calculation she was working through. Harold's version was quieter. It always was. He didn't talk about money directly. He talked about appearances, about how things looked, about what people might think if something didn't line up the way it should. "Family is everything," he said more than once in the weeks leading up to Christmas, the phrase delivered casually, like it was part of the background, something you say often enough that no one questions it. "We don't air our problems," he added once, not looking at anyone in particular. "That's not who we are." Who we are. The sentence had weight to it, not because it was true, because it was important to him that it stayed that way. I started to see the pattern then, not clearly, not all at once, but enough to recognize that the pieces were connected. Preston's urgency, Lydia's calculations, Harold's insistence on keeping everything looking intact, and somewhere underneath all of it, Lake Wren. The house I had been told didn't matter, the property that still had my name on it, the loan that shouldn't exist, the document I had signed without understanding. By the time the invitation for Christmas Eve came, it didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a step. "Dinner at 6, Lydia had said, handing me the details as if they were already agreed upon. "Everyone will be there." Everyone. The word lingered. "Do I need to bring anything?" I asked. "No," she said. "Just yourself." Just yourself. I almost smiled at that, because by then, I wasn't entirely sure which version of myself they expected to show up. The one who nodded, the one who signed, the one who didn't ask too many questions, or the one who had started to notice. The day of the dinner, the house was louder than usual, voices layered over each other, laughter that came a little too quickly, the sound of glasses being set down harder than necessary, the kind of noise that fills space when people don't want silence to settle long enough for anything real to surface. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, drying plates that were already dry, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, giving myself a reason to watch without being watched. Preston arrived late. He always did when something was wrong. His smile was in place, but it didn't hold. It slipped at the edges, just enough that you could see the strain underneath if you were looking for it. "Mom," he said, leaning in for a quick hug that ended before it fully began. "You look good." "Thank you," I replied. He moved past me almost immediately, already reaching for his phone. Lydia followed him with her eyes, not her body. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Just busy." Busy. The word landed flat. Harold was already at the table, adjusting the placement of the chairs, making small corrections that no one else would have noticed, but that mattered to him in a way that felt larger than the act itself. "Let's keep things smooth tonight," he said quietly, not looking at me, but making sure I heard it. Smooth. Another word that meant more than it appeared to. We sat down just before 6. The table was set the way it always was for holidays. Plates aligned, glasses placed just so, everything in its place, everything appearing as it should. From the outside, it would have looked perfect. From the inside, it felt arranged. I took my seat, the same one, the one they had left for me, at the edge, close enough to be included, far enough to be managed. Conversation started easily, too easily. Preston talked about work, but not in detail. Lydia filled in the spaces with stories about the kids, about schedules, about things that sounded normal enough to carry the moment forward. Harold nodded at the right times, added a comment here and there, keeping the tone steady, controlled, exactly where he wanted it. And underneath all of it, something else moved. Not visible, not spoken, but present. I watched the way Preston's eyes flicked toward Lydia at certain moments. The way Lydia responded without words, a slight shift in posture, a brief tightening around her mouth. The way Harold let the conversation drift just long enough before pulling it back to safer ground. They were waiting. Not for the food, not for the conversation, for something else. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled in slowly, like something finding its place after being displaced. This dinner wasn't about Christmas. It wasn't about family. It wasn't even about me. It was about timing, about getting everyone in the same room. About creating a moment that could be framed a certain way, presented as something normal, something expected. So that when the real reason surfaced, it wouldn't look like what it was. I looked down at my plate, at the careful arrangement of everything I had helped prepare, at the small details that made the evening appear whole. And then, slowly, I lifted my eyes. Around the table, at each of them, not as my family, but as people with something to gain. Preston, who needed money he didn't have. Lydia, who had already started calculating where it could come from. Harold, who needed everything to look intact, no matter what it actually was. And in that moment, the last piece settled into place. The house, Lake Wren, my name on the record. The loan, the document I had signed, the way they had started calling me confused. The way they had moved me out of my own room. The way they had begun handling everything for me. It wasn't random.
It wasn't concern. It wasn't help. It was a plan. And I was sitting in the middle of it. The dinner wasn't about Christmas. It was about making sure I stayed exactly where they needed me to be, long enough to take what they had already decided was theirs. By the time the plates had been cleared halfway and the candles had burned down to uneven pools of wax that clung to the glass like something trying not to collapse, I already knew, without anyone saying it out loud, that the evening had been arranged around a moment that hadn't happened yet, something precise and deliberate that required all of us to be in the same room at the same time, under the same light, with just enough witnesses to make it feel ordinary and just enough pressure to make it difficult to refuse. The conversation moved the way it always did when people were avoiding something that mattered more than what they were actually saying, circling around harmless topics, repeating details that didn't need repeating, stretching simple stories into longer ones so the silence wouldn't have space to settle. And yet beneath all of it, there was a current, low, controlled, persistent, that I could feel in the way Preston kept checking his phone without reading anything, in the way Lydia's attention drifted toward Harold every few minutes as if waiting for a signal, and most of all, in the way Harold himself sat at the head of the table with the calm that was just a little too steady to be natural, the kind of calm that doesn't come from ease but from certainty about what is going to happen next. When he finally set his fork down, the sound was small but intentional. The metal touching the plate with just enough force to carry across the table without announcing itself. And the conversation didn't stop all at once, so much as thin out, one voice fading, then another, until what was left was something quieter, something more focused, something waiting. "Well," he said, dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin before folding it once and placing it beside his plate with that same careful precision he applied to everything that mattered. "Before we get too far into dessert, there's something we should take care of." There was no question in it, no invitation, only a shift in direction that assumed agreement before it was given. And I felt it land not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. Something that had been building in the days leading up to this moment through fragments of conversation, through numbers glimpsed out of context, through the way certain topics appeared and disappeared too quickly to be accidental. He reached down beside his chair and brought up the envelope, the same one I had seen before, cream-colored and heavier than it needed to be, the yellow tab already placed along the edge with a black arrow pointing toward the line where my name would go, as if the outcome had been decided long before the document ever touched the table. And he slid it toward me with a movement so smooth it could have been mistaken for routine if you weren't paying attention to how everyone else reacted. No one spoke, but the room adjusted itself around that single motion in a way that made the air feel denser, as though something invisible had shifted into place. And I could feel eyes not looking directly at me, but not looking away either, hovering just close enough to register every movement I made without committing to the act of watching. "Just some paperwork," Harold said, his voice even, measured, carrying the same tone he used when explaining something simple, something already agreed upon. "We've been meaning to get this finalized." The word settled into the space between us, finalized, not as a description, but as an expectation, and I placed my hand on the edge of the envelope without opening it, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper inside, the quiet certainty that whatever it contained had been arranged with care, not for clarity, but for outcome. "What is it?" I asked, and although I kept my voice steady, I could feel the way the question moved through the room, touching each of them differently depending on what they already knew. "It's nothing complicated, Mom," Lydia said, leaning forward slightly, her tone soft in a way that was meant to reassure but carried something sharper underneath, something practiced. "Just some adjustments for the property, that's all." The property. She didn't specify which one, but she didn't need to. "Which property?" I asked, not because I didn't know what she meant, but because I wanted to hear it said. There was a pause then, small but measurable, the kind of pause that reveals more than the answer itself, and it was Preston who filled it, his voice coming a fraction too quickly, as if the silence had pressed on him just long enough to force the words out. "The Lake Wren house," he said. And there it was. Not hidden, Not softened, not explained away, but placed directly in front of me in a way that made everything that had come before it, every denial, every deflection, every quiet dismissal, shift slightly out of alignment. I opened the envelope slowly, sliding the paper out and unfolding it along the creases that had already been made for me, the document spreading across the table between us like something that had been waiting for this exact moment to exist, and I let my eyes move over it, not to understand it all at once, but to recognize its shape. The placement of the paragraphs, the density of the language, the small markers that indicated where attention was expected and where it was not. "Just sign where it's tabbed," Lydia said, her voice low, almost encouraging, as if this were a small favor, something routine, something that didn't require thought. I picked up the pen, Preston's pen. The same one from before. It settled into my hand with a familiarity that didn't feel like coincidence anymore, and I lowered it toward the page, feeling the weight of the room gather around that single movement, every breath, every small shift of posture aligning itself with what was supposed to happen next. And then I stopped. Not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, if attention hadn't already been there, but in a quiet, deliberate pause that existed just long enough to change the direction of the moment. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the page rather than on them, because I wanted to hear the answer without the distraction of their expressions. "It's just a transfer," Preston said, leaning forward slightly, his voice tightening in a way that made the explanation feel less like information and more like urgency. "To simplify things, for taxes, for management, it's easier if everything is consolidated." "Under whose name?" I asked, lifting my gaze now, not quickly, not challengingly, but steadily enough that the question couldn't be dismissed. There it was again, the pause, longer this time, stretching just far enough that it had to be filled, and Harold was the one who did it. "Ours," he said. "Not mine, ours." The words settled over the table with a weight that no one acknowledged, but everyone felt, and I let it sit there for a moment before I spoke again. Not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted them to hear it the way I did. "And what happens to it after that?" I asked. "It stays in the family," Lydia replied, her voice smooth, controlled, already moving past the question as if the answer were enough. "It is already in the family," I said, and this time I did not lower my voice. The silence that followed was no longer accidental. It was the kind that arrives when something has been said that cannot be reshaped into something easier to accept. Preston shifted in his chair, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the table, his composure slipping just enough to show the strain underneath. "Mom," he said, his tone changing, losing the softness, gaining something harder. "This isn't a big deal. You're making it into one." "Am I?" I asked, and although the question was simple, it carried everything I had begun to understand, everything that had been building in small, quiet ways over the past weeks. Lydia leaned in, her voice lowering, her words sharpened by restraint. "Yes," she said, "you are." I could feel the others at the table now, their discomfort no longer hidden, their eyes dropping, their hands moving without purpose, caught in a moment they hadn't expected to witness but could not leave. Harold's hand came down flat against the table then, his fingers spread slightly, grounding himself before he spoke, and when he did, he used the name he reserved for moments that required control. "Margaret," he said, his voice even, deliberate. "We've gone over this. There's no reason to drag it out." "I don't remember going over this," I replied. And I let the truth of that sit there without softening it, without qualifying it, without giving them space to reshape it into something else. "That's exactly the issue," Lydia said, and this time there was no softness in it, only the edge. Preston leaned forward again, his voice lowering, shifting into something that might have sounded like concern to anyone who didn't know how carefully it was constructed. "We're worried about you," he said. "This isn't like you." And for a moment, just a moment, I could feel the old doubt move beneath the surface, the familiar question rising the way it had before, quiet but persistent. What if they're right? But then I looked at the page again, at the line where my name was expected, at the way the document had been prepared, at the way the conversation had been shaped, and the doubt didn't disappear. It settled into something else. Understanding. This wasn't about my memory, it was about their timing. Harold spoke again, and this time he leaned in just enough that the words felt closer, heavier, meant only for me but heard by everyone. "Don't embarrass me," he said. The sentence was quiet, controlled, and it carried more weight than anything else that had been said all night. Not because of how it sounded, but because of what it assumed. That I would choose him. That I would choose the appearance of peace over the truth of what was happening. That I would protect him the way I always had. I held the pen in my hand for a moment longer, feeling its weight, its expectation, the years behind it that had taught me to sign, to agree, to move things forward without asking too many questions. And then, slowly, deliberately, I placed it back on the table. Not dropped, not pushed away, set down. "I'm not signing this," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. In that silence, with 14 people at the table and every one of them aware of exactly what had just happened, the words carried further than anything else could have. Because for the first time in that room, in that house, in a long time, I had not done what they expected, and that changed everything. For a few seconds after I said it, after the pen had been set down and the sentence had settled into the room in a way no one could pretend not to hear, nothing moved. Not the candles, not the glasses, not even the small sounds that usually fill the space when people don't know what to say. It wasn't silence in the usual sense. It was something tighter than that, something held. Harold didn't react immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. If this had been any other moment, any smaller disagreement, any ordinary correction, he would have stepped in quickly, adjusted the tone, smoothed the edges, brought the room back to something presentable. This time, he stayed very still. His hand remained flat on the table, fingers spread just slightly, as if he were anchoring himself to something that had already started to shift beneath him. Preston was the one who broke first. "Mom," he said, and there was no softness in it now, only urgency. The word landing too fast, too sharp. "Don't do this here." Here. That word mattered. Because it wasn't about what I was doing, it was about where I was doing it. In front of people, in front of witnesses, in front of a version of the family they had worked very carefully to maintain. "I'm not doing anything," I replied, keeping my voice steady, not louder, not smaller, just present. "I'm just not signing something I don't understand." "You do understand," Lydia said, leaning forward, her voice low, controlled, but carrying that edge I had begun to recognize, the one that appeared when control started to slip. "We've explained this to you multiple times." "No," I said, and this time I didn't hesitate. "You've told me it's nothing. That's not the same thing." A few heads turned then, not toward me, toward them. The shift was small, but it was enough. Because the moment someone else starts looking at the same thing you're looking at, it becomes harder to pretend it isn't there. "Margaret," Harold said again, his voice firmer now, less controlled, the calm beginning to thin at the edges. "This is not the time." "For what?" I asked. "For this," he said, gesturing lightly toward the paper, the table, the room, as if the entire situation could be reduced to something vague and inconvenient. "For asking what I'm signing?" I replied. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Preston pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the tension more sharply than anything that had been said. "Look," he said, running a hand through his hair, his composure starting to crack in small, visible ways. "We're just trying to fix something that's complicated. That's all this is." "What's complicated?" I asked. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Lydia. And that was the moment. Not when he spoke, when he didn't. Because for the first time that night, the answer wasn't immediate. It had to be chosen, carefully, measured. Evelyn moved then. She had been quiet the entire evening, seated 2 places down, her hands folded neatly in front of her, observing in a way that didn't draw attention to itself but didn't miss anything either. When she stood, she did it without urgency, without hesitation, the movement deliberate in a way that made the room adjust around it. Actually, she said, her voice calm, clear, and entirely unhurried, I think this is exactly the time. Every head turned, not because she raised her voice, because she didn't. There is a certain kind of authority that doesn't need volume, it just needs truth. Harold's expression changed then, not dramatically, just enough. A tightening at the jaw, a slight shift in his posture, recognition. Evelyn, he said, and this time her name sounded less like a greeting and more like a warning. This isn't necessary. She didn't respond to him, not directly. Instead, she reached down beside her chair and lifted a leather folder onto the table, placing it between the plates with the same careful precision Harold had used minutes earlier. But where his movement had been about control, hers was about exposure. I came tonight because Rose asked me to make sure something was handled properly, she said, opening the folder slowly, her fingers moving through the documents with practiced familiarity. And after what I've just heard, I think it's important we all understand exactly what was supposed to happen. The word supposed landed heavily. She pulled out the first document and placed it flat on the table, turning it slightly so it faced not just her, not just Harold, but everyone. Deed of transfer, she said. Lake Wren property, signed by Rose Whitaker, transferring full ownership to Margaret Ellison. My name, again. But this time not on a screen, not in a memory, on paper. Official, filed, real. I felt my breath shift, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed it. That document was executed 3 years ago, Evelyn continued, her tone steady, factual, the way you read something that doesn't need interpretation. Filed with the county, recorded, legally binding. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. I could feel it, the truth settling into place. Preston shifted again, more visibly now, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. Lydia's fingers curled slightly around her glass. Harold didn't move. Not yet. Evelyn reached into the folder again. This, she said, sliding a second document forward, is a bank transfer confirmation. The paper made a soft sound as it touched the table. $650,000, she continued, from Rose Whitaker's account to an account held jointly by Harold and Margaret Ellison. The number didn't echo. It didn't need to. It sat there, heavy, complete, for the purposes of maintaining the property and ensuring Margaret had full financial access to it, Evelyn added. I heard a chair shift, not mine, someone else's, because the room was changing. The narrative that had been quietly constructed over months, maybe years, was starting to come apart. That money, I began, but the sentence didn't finish itself, because I didn't know where it had gone. Evelyn did. That money was withdrawn, she said, turning another page, her voice still calm, still precise. In a series of transactions over the following 18 months. She didn't list them all. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. Preston looked down. Lydia didn't. Harold finally moved, just slightly, a shift in his shoulders, a tightening of his hand against the table. That's not the full context, he said, his voice returning, but not with the same control it had before. There were circumstances. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt loudly. She simply placed one more document on the table and read. Email correspondence, she said, from Harold Ellison to Rose Whitaker. She glanced down at the page, then back up, her voice steady as she quoted it. Everything has been handled. Margaret received the property and the funds. She's taken care of. The words hung there, clear, undeniable, written, not remembered, not misinterpreted, documented. I turned my head slowly toward Harold. He didn't look at me, not right away. He looked at the table, at the documents, at the place where his version of the story had just been replaced with something that couldn't be reshaped. You said I received everything, I said, my voice quieter now, but steadier than it had been all night. He swallowed, the movement small, visible. That's what I was told, he said. It wasn't an answer. It was an attempt, a small one. Too late. Evelyn closed the folder. Not sharply, not dramatically, just finished.
"I don't deal in misunderstandings," she said, her voice returning to something neutral, something professional. "I deal in records, and the records are very clear." No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that could undo what had just been placed in front of them. The story they had built, the one that depended on my confusion, my silence, my willingness to accept what I was told without question, had been dismantled, piece by piece, in front of everyone. I looked down at the paper again, at my name, at the lines I hadn't read, at the space where they had expected me to sign, and then I looked back up, not at the documents, not at Evelyn, at Harold. For the first time that night, he met my eyes, and in that moment there was no confusion, no misunderstanding, no version of the story left to hide behind, only the truth and the realization that it had just been seen. After Evelyn closed the folder, the room didn't break the way I expected it to. No one raised their voice. No one stood up in outrage. No plates shattered. No accusations flew across the table the way they do in stories where the truth arrives like a storm. Instead, everything held. Too well. Like a structure that had already been cracking for a long time, but had learned how to stay standing anyway, even after the damage became visible. The candles continued to burn, their flames small and steady, the wax slipping down the sides in slow, quiet trails that gathered at the base as if nothing had changed. The table was still set. The glasses were still full. From the outside, it would have looked like a family finishing dinner. From where I sat, it felt like something had already ended. I kept my eyes on Harold for a moment longer, waiting, not for an apology, not even for an explanation, but for something that resembled acknowledgement, some shift that would indicate he understood what had just been revealed. It didn't come. His gaze dropped again, not in guilt, not fully, but in calculation, the kind that moves quickly through options, through possible responses, through ways to contain what could no longer be denied. Lydia reached for her glass then, her hand steady, her posture unchanged, but I could see the tension in the way her fingers curled around the stem, tighter than necessary, as if holding on to something that was beginning to slip. Preston didn't move at all. He sat there, his hands resting flat against the table, his shoulders slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the space between the documents, as if the truth could still be rearranged if he looked at it long enough. I shifted my attention to him slowly, because something in Evelyn's words, something in the timing, in the sequence of what had been revealed, had left a space that hadn't been filled yet. The money had been transferred, the property had been signed over, the documents had been handled, and yet, that didn't explain everything. "Preston," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. In that room, with everything already exposed, his name carried exactly as far as it needed to. He didn't look up right away. His jaw tightened slightly, a small movement, but one I recognized. The same expression he used when he was younger, when he knew he had done something wrong but hadn't yet decided whether to admit it or wait to be asked again. "Preston," I repeated, softer this time, but steadier, more direct. He lifted his head then, slowly, reluctantly, and when he looked at me, there was no confusion in his expression, no surprise, no attempt to pretend he didn't understand what I was asking, only the quiet, unavoidable awareness of someone who had already crossed a line and could no longer step back from it. "How long?" I asked. The question didn't need to be explained, not after everything that had been laid out, not after the documents, the transfers, the email. "How long did you know?" The room tightened again, not with the anticipation of something new, but with the weight of something deeper, something more personal than the legal language Evelyn had placed in front of them. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. This was about him. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled motion, as if he were trying to steady something inside himself before speaking. "Mom," he began, and then stopped, the word catching just enough to show it wasn't coming as easily as he wanted it to. "Just answer me," I said. Not sharp, not angry, clear. He looked at Lydia for a second, just a second, and that was enough. Because whatever answer he gave next, it wasn't just his, it belonged to all of them, but he was the one who had to say it. "I knew," he said finally. The words came out quiet, flat, not defensive, not apologetic, just true. I felt something shift inside me then, not in a way that broke, but in a way that settled, like something that had been moving for a long time had finally found the place it was always going to land. "Knew what?" I asked, because there is a difference between hearing something and understanding it fully, and I needed him to say it in a way that left no space for interpretation. "That the house was yours," he said, his voice steadier now, as if once the first part was spoken, the rest could follow more easily. "That the money was supposed to be yours, too." There it was, not hidden, not softened, placed directly between us. "And you didn't tell me," I said. It wasn't a question. He shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "Why?" I asked. This time, the question carried something else. Not just confusion, not just hurt, something heavier. Something that had been building quietly through every small moment that had led us here. He looked down again, his hands tightening against the edge of the table, his fingers pressing into the wood as if he needed something solid beneath them. "We thought," he started, then stopped, his jaw tightening again, his eyes closing briefly before he forced himself to continue. "We thought you wouldn't need it." The sentence didn't land all at once. It unfolded, word by word. "We thought you wouldn't need it." I felt the air shift in my chest, not sharply, not violently, but in a way that made it harder to breathe, the same way I had a moment before. "You thought I wouldn't need it," I repeated, not raising my voice, not adding anything to the words, just returning them to him exactly as he had given them to me. He nodded once, a small movement. "Yes." "For what?" I asked. "For anything," he said, and now there was something else in his voice, something that sounded almost like justification, like he was trying to explain something that made sense to him, even if it didn't to me. "You were fine. You had the house. You had... Everything was stable, and we..." He stopped again, because the rest of that sentence didn't need to be finished. I already understood it. You were fine, and we weren't. I sat back slightly, the chair pressing into my back in a way that grounded me more than anything else in that room. "And so you used it," I said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence did it for him. "For how long?" I asked. "A while," he said. "How long, Preston?" This time, the words carried weight, not anger, expectation. He swallowed, his throat working visibly before he answered. "From the beginning," he said. The phrase landed differently than anything else that had been said. From the beginning, not after something went wrong, not as a temporary solution, not as a mistake. From the beginning. I felt my hands rest more firmly in my lap, my fingers pressing lightly against each other as I let that settle. Fully, completely, without softening it. "So, when I was working," I said slowly, the words forming carefully, each one placed with intention. "When I was paying my own bills, when I was moving downstairs because it was safer, when you were telling me I was confused," I looked at him directly. "You already knew." He didn't look away this time. "No," he said. And that was the moment. Not when the documents were placed on the table. Not when Harold was exposed. Not when the money was traced. This. Because betrayal from strangers is one thing. Betrayal from someone who has sat at your table, who has called you mom, who has looked at you and chosen, again and again, to let you believe something that wasn't true, that lands somewhere deeper. "You let me think I was losing my mind," I said. The room didn't move. No one interrupted. No one corrected. He didn't deny it. "We didn't think it was like that," he said, his voice quieter now, thinner, as if the words were losing strength even as he spoke them. "We thought it was easier this way." Easier. The word came back again. It always did. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, because I understood. Not the justification, the pattern. Everything that had happened. The room, the documents, the silence, the way they had spoken to me, the way they had moved me, the way they had explained things just enough to keep me from asking more. It had all been built on that one idea: easier for them. I looked around the table then, at Lydia, at Harold, at the others who had become part of something they may not have fully understood, but had still participated in by staying quiet. And then I looked back at Preston, at my son, at the person who had known from the beginning and had still chosen to let it happen. For a moment, I thought I might feel anger, something sharp, something immediate. Instead, what came was something quieter, something heavier, something that didn't need to rise to be felt. I see, I said. And I did. Completely. Because once someone tells you who they are, not in words, not in excuses, but in choices repeated over time, there isn't anything left to question, only something to decide. And for the first time that night, I was already deciding. After Preston's words settled into the room, after we thought you wouldn't need it had taken its place alongside everything else that had already been said and could not be taken back, something inside the evening shifted again. Not toward resolution, not toward apology, but toward something quieter and, in its own way, more disturbing. Because the truth, once it begins to surface, rarely stops where you expect it to. It keeps going. Not loudly, not all at once, but in layers. Evelyn had not closed her folder completely. That was the first thing I noticed. While the rest of the table remained suspended in that heavy, uncertain silence that follows a confession no one can soften, she adjusted the edge of the documents in front of her with a small, almost absent-minded motion. The kind someone makes when they know they are not finished yet, but are deciding how much more needs to be said. "Evelyn," Harold said, his voice lower now, less certain than it had been earlier. "This has gone far enough." It was an attempt, not to deny, to contain, but she didn't look at him. She reached into the folder again, slower this time, as though she were choosing carefully. Not which document to reveal, but what kind of truth the room was ready to hold next. "I wish it had," she said, her tone steady, not confrontational, not emotional. Simply factual in a way that made it harder to argue with. But there's one more thing that directly relates to what Margaret just said. No one asked her to continue. No one stopped her either, because at that point, stopping her would have required a kind of authority that no longer belonged to anyone at that table. She placed a thin stack of photographs down in front of her, not loose, bound. An album, small enough to pass from hand to hand, but thick enough to suggest intention, something assembled over time rather than gathered all at once. Lydia's hand tightened around her glass. Preston didn't move. Harold looked at the album for a moment, and in that brief pause, short enough that anyone not watching closely might have missed it, something passed across his face that had not been there before. Recognition, not of the object, of what it meant. "What is that?" I asked, my voice quieter now but not weaker, simply more focused, because by then I understood that the details mattered, that the small things were often where the truth hid most effectively. Evelyn turned the album toward me and slid it across the table. "These," she said, "were sent to Rose over the past 2 years. 2 years, the same 2 years. The same stretch of time in which I had called and not been answered, had waited and been told to wait longer, had believed, because I had been given no reason not to, that distance had formed naturally, quietly, without intention." I placed my hand on the cover. It was smooth, newer than it should have been, the kind of thing you pick up from a store because it looks clean, presentable, appropriate for something you want to show someone else. Not something you keep for yourself, something you create for an audience. I opened it, slowly. The first photograph sat on the page, centered, bordered in white. A family dinner, this house, this table. The same plates, the same glasses, the same arrangement of people. Lydia was smiling. Preston had his arm resting casually along the back of a chair. Harold sat at the head of the table, looking exactly the way he always did in photographs, composed, in control, the image of stability. And me. I was there, seated between them, smiling. But the moment I saw it, I knew.
Not because something obvious was wrong, because something felt misaligned. The light didn't sit the same way on my face as it did on the others. The angle was just slightly off. The shadow beneath my chin didn't match the direction of the light in the room. It was subtle, careful, convincing. If you didn't know what you were looking for. I turned the page. Another photograph. A day at the lake. Preston standing near the water. Lydia beside him. Harold in the background. All of them positioned in a way that suggested ease, familiarity, the kind of unspoken comfort that comes from time spent together. And again, I was there, standing between them, smiling, wearing a blouse I hadn't owned in years, a blouse I had donated. I felt my fingers press more firmly against the edge of the page, not shaking, not trembling, grounding. I turned another page, a birthday, a cake, candles, Nora laughing, Lydia leaning in, Harold mid-sentence, and me. Placed just slightly to the side, close enough to belong, far enough to be adjusted. Each image was like that, carefully constructed, consistent, a version of a life that looked complete, that looked whole, that looked like I had been present for all of it. But I hadn't been, not in the way the photographs suggested, not in the way they were meant to show. "How many of these are there?" I asked, not looking up yet, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Enough," Evelyn replied, "to establish a pattern." I turned one more page, and there, at the corner of the image, I saw it, a slight blur. A line where the background didn't quite meet the figure the way it should have. A place where something had been added, not naturally, deliberately. I closed the album, slowly, carefully. The sound of it settling against the table was soft, but in that room, it carried. "They were sent to Rose," Evelyn continued, her voice steady, "to show that Margaret was doing well, that she was involved, that she was included." Included. The word sat there, empty. Because inclusion doesn't need to be proven, it exists. Or it doesn't. I lifted my eyes then, not to Evelyn, to them, to Lydia, to Preston, to Harold. None of them spoke. None of them reached for the album. None of them tried to deny it. Because denial would have required a version of the truth that no longer existed. "You sent her these," I said, not as a question, but as a statement placed where it could not be moved. Lydia inhaled, her shoulders rising slightly, her gaze dropping for a moment before she lifted it again, her expression composed, but thinner now, the control still there, but strained. "We wanted her to feel at ease," she said. "At ease," I repeated. "Yes," she continued, and now there was something else in her voice, something defensive, something that tried to justify what could not be undone. "She worried about you, Mom, and we thought it would be better if she believed everything was good." Good. The word echoed softly against everything I had just seen, everything I had not been part of, everything that had been built without me and then presented as if I had been there all along. I let the silence stretch, not because I didn't know what to say, because I wanted them to sit in it, fully, without interruption, without escape. "You didn't just take my money," I said finally, my voice quieter than it had been before, but carrying something deeper now. Something that had settled into place piece by piece over the course of the evening. "You built an entire version of my life that I was never actually allowed to live. And then you documented it carefully enough to convince someone else that I had been happy inside it." No one spoke, because there was nothing left to soften that, nothing left to reframe, nothing left to pretend. I rested my hand lightly on the album, on the cover, on the thing that had turned absence into evidence. "You didn't just take my money," I said again, and this time the words came more slowly, not because I was searching for them, but because I wanted each one to land exactly where it belonged. "You erased me in a way that required planning, time, and a willingness to look at something that wasn't real and call it truth long enough that even you started to believe it." Preston looked down. Lydia didn't move. Harold's gaze shifted, not away, not entirely, but just enough to avoid the full weight of what was in front of him. And in that moment, the last piece fell into place. Not the money, not the documents, not even the confession. This, Because what they had taken was one thing, what they had replaced it with was something else entirely. And once you understand that someone has not only taken something from you, but has also created a version of you that serves their story better than the real one ever did, you don't ask what happened anymore. You decide what happens next. There is a version of this moment people expect. Voices raised, chairs pushed back, the sharp edge of anger cutting through everything that came before it until the room can no longer pretend to hold itself together. I understood that expectation. I could feel it sitting just beneath the surface of the table, in the way people held their breath without realizing it, in the way a few of them shifted in their seats as if preparing for something louder, something easier to recognize as conflict. But what they didn't understand, what none of them had ever needed to understand before, was that not every ending announces itself that way. Some endings arrive quietly, not because they are smaller, because they are final. I looked down at the documents one last time, at the neat alignment of pages that had been prepared in advance, at the signature lines that assumed compliance, at the careful placement of tabs that were meant to guide my hand, in the same way Lydia's voice had guided it weeks earlier. And I felt something settle inside me with a kind of clarity that didn't require urgency, didn't require anger, didn't require anything other than the simple recognition that I no longer belonged to the version of myself they had been counting on. The pen sat where I had left it, slightly angled, as if it had been placed there mid-thought and forgotten. And for a moment I considered how easily the evening could still be redirected, how quickly the room would return to something that resembled normal if I simply picked it back up, signed where they had asked, allowed the conversation to move forward as if nothing significant had happened. It would have been easy. That was the part that lingered. Not the difficulty of refusing, the simplicity of agreeing. I reached for the document, my fingers sliding beneath the top page, lifting it just enough to separate it from the rest of the stack. And I could feel the attention shift again, the room narrowing its focus, every small movement taking on more meaning than it should have, because they were still hoping, quietly, stubbornly, that I would do what I had always done, that I would make it easier, for them. The paper felt heavier than it looked, thicker, more permanent. I held it there for a second, long enough to understand exactly what it represented, not just in legal terms, but in the shape of the life they had constructed around it. The assumptions built into every line, every signature space, every carefully chosen word that had been designed to pass as routine. And then, without raising my voice, without looking at anyone in particular, I tore it. The sound was not loud. It didn't need to be. It cut cleanly through the quiet, the fibers separating in a way that was final, irreversible. And I felt something release in that moment. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just complete. No one moved, not immediately, because what they had expected was resistance. What they received was refusal, and those are not the same thing. I set the torn pieces back down on the table, aligning them almost unconsciously, the way you do when you are used to keeping things in order even after they've been broken. And then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the set of keys I had taken earlier that day, the ones Lydia had assumed I wouldn't notice. The ones that had been placed in the small dish by the door alongside Harold's, as if proximity made them interchangeable. I turned them once in my hand, the metal catching the light from the candles, and then placed them on top of the documents, directly in the center of the table where no one could pretend not to see them. The Lake Wren keys. Mine. Always mine. You didn't think I'd fight back, I said, my voice quiet enough that it didn't break the room, but steady enough that it held it in place, every word landing exactly where it was meant to, because I never had to before. The sentence didn't rise, it settled. Not as a threat, not as a warning, as a fact. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't look to see who would speak first, who would try to reshape the moment into something manageable, something that could still be explained away or softened with the right combination of words. Because I understood, finally and completely, that there was nothing left in that room that I needed to negotiate. No version of the conversation that would restore what had already been taken. No apology that would change what had been done in its place. I stood up slowly, the chair moving back with a soft scrape against the floor, the sound carrying just enough to mark the shift from sitting to leaving, from participating to ending.
and I reached for my coat where it rested against the back of the chair, the fabric cool under my fingers, familiar in a way that grounded me more than anything else in that space. "Margaret," Harold said, and this time there was something different in it, not authority, not control, something closer to uncertainty, something that had not been present before. I paused, not turning fully, just enough that he knew I had heard him.
"This doesn't have to be handled like this,"
he added, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if the framework he relied on had shifted and he was still trying to find where to stand. I considered that for a moment, not the words themselves, the assumption behind them, that there was still a way to handle it together, that there was still a version of this where I stayed. "It already has been," I said, and then I turned. The room did not follow me immediately. That was the second thing I noticed. They stayed where they were, seated, still arranged around the table as if the shape of the evening could hold even without me, as if the structure they had built could remain intact simply by refusing to move. I walked toward the front door the way I had walked through that house for years. Not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a familiarity that no longer felt like belonging. Just memory, just the repetition of a path that had been walked often enough to exist without thought. The hallway light flickered slightly as I passed beneath it. The small inconsistency, something I might have fixed once, something I might have made a note of and handled without being asked. The way I had handled so many things that no one else noticed because they were never the ones looking. I didn't stop this time. I reached the door, placed my hand on the handle, and opened it. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharper, cleaner, the kind of cold that doesn't ask anything of you except that you feel it fully. And I stepped out into it without looking back, because I already knew what was behind me. A table set for a version of a family that no longer included me. Documents that no longer mattered. People who had mistaken my silence for absence, my patience for permission, my presence for something they could rearrange without consequence. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just finished. And for the first time in a long time, I understood something clearly enough that it didn't need to be repeated. I hadn't lost anything in that room. I had taken it back, all of it. And I had done it without raising my voice, without asking for it, without fighting. Because the truth, once it is fully seen, doesn't need to argue. It simply leaves. The first morning at Lake Wren didn't feel like a victory. That's the part I didn't expect. After everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed, everything that had finally broken in a way that could not be repaired, I thought there would be something louder waiting on the other side of it. Relief, maybe. Or a sense of closure that arrived all at once and made the rest of it easier to carry. Instead, what I found was quiet, not empty, just unclaimed. The house itself was exactly as I remembered it, and nothing like it at all. The structure unchanged, the same sloping roofline, the same narrow path leading down toward the water, the same wooden porch that had held more summers than I could count, but the feeling of it had shifted in a way that took time to understand. Because for the first time since it had been placed in my name, it wasn't something distant, something theoretical, something that existed on paper while my life happened somewhere else. It was mine, fully, not because someone said it was, because no one else could take it anymore. I unlocked the door that first morning with a kind of attention that felt almost ceremonial, the key turning more slowly than it needed to, the metal catching just slightly before giving way. And when I stepped inside, the air held that familiar mixture of dust and wood and something faintly sweet from the cedar lining in the hallway closet, a scent that had always belonged to this place and had never been replicated anywhere else. There were small things that needed tending. Of course there were. A window that stuck halfway when you tried to open it, a hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had loosened over time, the faint outline on the wall where a picture had once hung and then been removed without anyone repainting the space beneath it. I noticed all of it, not as problems, as evidence, of time, of use, of a life that had continued in quiet ways, even while I had been told it wasn't mine to step into. I set my bag down near the kitchen table, smaller than the one I had left behind, older, slightly uneven at one leg in a way that made it rock just a fraction if you leaned on it the wrong way, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the space settle around me, letting the reality of it arrive without forcing it into anything larger than it was.
Later that afternoon, I opened the windows. Not all at once, one at a time. The sound of each latch lifting, each frame shifting, each pane giving way to the air outside created a rhythm that felt more grounding than anything else I had experienced in weeks. The cool breeze moving through the house in slow, steady currents that carried the scent of the lake with it, clean, slightly mineral, unmistakably real. I found the old kettle in the cabinet exactly where I remembered leaving it years ago, the handle worn smooth in the places it had been held most often, and I filled it at the sink, set it on the stove, and stood there watching the water begin to heat. The small, familiar act anchoring me in a way that no conversation from the night before had been able to. When the kettle began to hum, I poured the water into a chipped mug I had found at the back of the cabinet, one with a faint crack along the side that didn't leak but suggested it might someday. And I carried it to the table, setting it down carefully before taking a seat. The chair shifted slightly beneath me, the uneven leg adjusting itself against the floor, and I reached down instinctively, folding a piece of paper from my bag and placing it beneath the corner to steady it. Some habits don't leave you, they just change where they're used. I sat there for a long time, the steam from the mug rising in thin, curling lines that caught the light coming through the window. The surface of the lake visible just beyond the trees, moving in small, consistent patterns that didn't ask anything of me except that I noticed them. No one called that morning. Not immediately. The silence wasn't unfamiliar, but this time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. By the end of the week, the calls started. Harold first. His voice on the other end of the line was measured, controlled in a way that suggested he had already rehearsed what he was going to say. But underneath it, there was something new, something thinner, less certain, as if the structure he relied on had been removed and he was still trying to find his footing without it. "We can resolve this," he said, his tone steady, almost professional, as if this were a matter that could be handled with the right combination of language and timing. "There are options." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't respond immediately. Because for the first time, I didn't feel the need to meet him where he was speaking from. "I'm not looking for options," I said finally. The line was quiet for a moment. Then he cleared his throat. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he replied. I almost smiled at that, because I understood now that difficulty had never been the issue. Control had been. "I'm not making anything," I said. "I'm just not fixing it for you anymore." He didn't call again that week. Preston called 3 days later, not with the same composure, not with the same careful structure. His voice was different now, stripped of the confidence it had carried before, the edges rougher, the sentences less complete, as if he were trying to build something stable out of words that no longer held together the way they used to. "They're coming after everything," he said, the urgency no longer hidden, no longer controlled. "The house, the accounts. Mom, I need you to talk to Evelyn, to stop this, just until I can—" I let him finish. I let the sentence reach the place where it would have once turned into something I would have agreed to, something I would have taken on without being asked directly. And then I answered. No. The word didn't need explanation. It didn't need to be expanded into something softer. It held on its own. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, quieter, almost disbelieving. "You'd let this happen?" I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes moving out toward the lake again, the surface steady, unchanged by the conversation. "You already did," I said. He didn't respond to that, because there wasn't anything left to say that would change it. Lydia didn't call. She sent a message, short, carefully worded. "We should talk." I read it once, then set the phone down. There are conversations that exist to understand something, and there are conversations that exist to reshape it. I was no longer interested in the second kind. By the end of the month, everything that had been hidden behind structure and timing and carefully managed appearances began to surface in ways that could not be contained. The second mortgage on the property, taken out without my knowledge, triggered a review that led back to the original transfer, to the documentation, to the inconsistencies that had once been small enough to ignore, but were now too large to dismiss. Harold lost the house he had tried to protect, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, piece by piece,
the same way everything else had come apart. Preston's business, whatever version of it he had been holding together with borrowed time and borrowed money, did not survive the pressure that followed, the debts he had been managing quietly becoming visible all at once, leaving no space for the kind of negotiation he had relied on before. Lydia left, not with an announcement, not with explanation, just a series of small absences that eventually added up to something permanent, her presence in that house diminishing until it was clear she had chosen distance over accountability, a decision that did not surprise me nearly as much as it once might have.
I heard these things the way you hear about weather in a place you used to live. Not unaffected, but no longer inside it. Weeks passed, then months. The house at Lake Wren began to take on a rhythm that belonged to me, not because I forced it to, but because I stopped adjusting myself to fit anything else. I repaired the hinge in the kitchen. I sanded the edge of the table where it had worn unevenly. I replaced the screen in the window that stuck. Small things, practical things, the kind of work that grounds you in a space more effectively than any declaration ever could. On a Thursday evening, sometime in early fall, I set the table for dinner. Not out of habit, out of choice. 2 plates. Not because I needed to fill the space, because someone was coming. Nora had called earlier that week, her voice lighter than I had heard it in a long time, the strain that had once sat just beneath her words no longer present in the same way. "Can I come by?" she had asked. "Of course," I said. When she arrived, she stood in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, taking in the space, the light, the quiet, as if she were trying to understand it before stepping fully inside. "It's different here," she said. "It is," I replied. We sat at the table. Not a large one, not perfectly matched, not arranged for an audience, just ours. I served the food slowly, the motions familiar, practiced over years that had been spent feeding people who had accepted it without ever asking what it cost. And as I set the plates down, I felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with what remained. I looked at her, at the way she sat, present, unguarded, not performing, not waiting for anything other than the moment in front of her. And I understood something with a clarity that did not require explanation. "I spent 40 years feeding people who made sure I stayed hungry," I said, my voice steady. Not heavy, not bitter, simply true in a way that no longer needed to be softened. Now I only cook for those who know how to stay. She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to, because some sentences are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be understood. Later that night, after she left, after the dishes had been washed and set to dry, after the house had settled back into its quiet rhythm, my phone lit up on the table beside me. A name, a familiar one. Mom. I looked at it for a moment, at the word, at everything it had once meant. And then I turned the phone over, not in anger, not in rejection, in recognition. "They still call me Mom," I said softly to the empty room, the words settling into the space with a quiet finality that felt more complete than anything else that had come before it. "I just don't answer anymore." If you've ever had to draw a line with your own family, I'd really like to hear your story. You can share it in the comments. And if this journey meant something to you, you can subscribe to stay with me for the next one. There's another story here on the channel that might feel closer to home than you expect. I didn't leave that house because I stopped loving them. I left because I finally understood what they were asking me to become. A woman who cooks, signs, and disappears quietly without ever asking where her life went. And that night, when I didn't sign that paper, when I walked out with nothing but my name and a set of keys that had always been mine, something shifted in a way that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. And maybe the real lesson isn't about what we lose when we finally see the truth clearly, but about the moment we understand that we are still allowed to keep ourselves, even if it means leaving everything else behind.